And the important thing at the end is the dedication of whatever positive energy or merit we've created by whatever activity we've done, whether it's a Dharma activity specifically or an everyday activity. So this morning we'll begin by generating a positive motivation for engaging in this course today. So just settling the mind and calling to mind your reasons for participating in this course. So just consider that the purpose of my life is not just to solve my own problems and find happiness for myself. I'm just one person. And even in terms of human beings, there are billions of other human beings. So in the face of those billions of other human beings, let alone the numberless other sentient beings, I become insignificant. And my happiness and my suffering is insignificant. And what is important is the happiness of others and for them to be free from suffering. So when we think about others being free from suffering, then it's important not just to think of immediate suffering, the suffering of pain, but as I was discussing yesterday with you, we need to also consider the subtler levels of suffering, the suffering of change, which refers to the things we normally regard as pleasures or sources of happiness, and to the fundamental suffering, pervasive compounding suffering, of all of us being caught in this cycle of suffering from life to life, because we don't have freedom, we don't have control, we're under the control of our negative karma and delusions. So generate a strong wish from your heart that every single living being is freed from all these three levels of suffering, the suffering of pain, the suffering of change, and pervasive compounding suffering. So that's the mind of compassion. So then the mind of love or loving kindness is the wish to bring happiness to others. So again, don't just think about immediate temporary happiness, things like long life, good health, comfortable situations, but think about ultimate happiness, long-term happiness, happiness that is without suffering. So the initial level of this is liberation from samsara, sometimes referred to as nirvana. But in Mahayana Buddhism, then the peerless level of happiness is the ultimate happiness of full enlightenment, that's free from every fault of the mind and perfected in all positive or good qualities. So generate a strong wish for every single living being, not just the billions of human beings, but even animals and beings in the other realms. Find this ultimate happiness, and not just the ultimate happiness of liberation from samsara, but the peerless happiness of full enlightenment, of becoming a fully awakened being. So just from your heart, generate a positive motivation that you're participating in this course, not for your own happiness and to be free of your own suffering, but to free every single living being from all the levels of suffering, even the subtle one of pervasive compounding suffering, and to bring them happiness, and not just temporary immediate happiness, but the peerless happiness of full enlightenment. And it's for that reason that you're going to listen to these teachings, and that I'm going to give these teachings. So now we'll just do a recap of what we went through yesterday in a summary form. So yesterday I explained the lineage of the Lojong teachings, the history of how they developed and how they came to Tibet. So of course, in Buddhism, lineage is very important, so that you know that the teachings you're receiving, or the base for the teachings you're receiving at least, is authentic and can be trusted. And so our teachings, the original source is, of course, Shakyamuni Buddha. But in a closer lineage, how these teachings came to Tibet is related to Lama Atisha, a famous Indian pundit from the 10th, 11th century. And as I explained yesterday, he underwent significant hardships to receive these teachings from a teacher in Sumatra, traveling from India to Sumatra by ship and spending 12 years studying the teachings on bodhicitta. And so on his return to India, he became a famous abbot of one of the 3 main monasteries in India. And then, because Buddhism had been established in Tibet, but there'd been some degeneration and confusion over the centuries, so there was a king who particularly wanted to bring back pure lineages of Buddhism in Tibet. So he sent translators to invite Lama Atisha. So after many difficulties, hardships, and even deaths of some of the people, then Lama Atisha reached Tibet. So he brought with him the lineage of many sutra and tantra teachings, including the Lojong teachings. So initially, these Lojong teachings were secret teachings, because it was felt that their kind of approach to spiritual practice was so radical that most people wouldn't understand it or wouldn't be able to apply it in their lives. So then what happened was, after, I'm not sure how many years, I think within 100 years of Lama Atisha passing away. So what happened, Lama Atisha had his main disciple was Lama Dromtumpa, who was a lay practitioner and said to be an earlier incarnation of the lineages of the Dalai Lamas. So he established a famous monastery in Tibet called Reting, and from that was the source of the Kadampa lineage, quite famous lineage. And so these were renowned practitioners, very practical approach to the Dharma, kind of a no-nonsense approach. And many of the famous stories that come in the thought transformation teachings are related to these Kadampa Geshis, they were called. And so they often practiced in very poor circumstances and very strictly, and basically didn't waste time. They just got down and did the job of practicing Dharma. So just to illustrate their kind of approach to the practice of Dharma. This morning I was thinking about a story about Langri Tangpa. So Langri Tangpa, we have a centre in Brisbane that's named after this particular Kadampa Geshe. So he's famous for composing the text called the 8 Verses of Thought Transformation. So he was actually known as, he had a nickname as a black-faced Lama because he was always really severe and didn't smile or laugh much. And it said the only time he was known to smile was one time when he was doing a retreat and there was a large turquoise on his altar, and a mouse came along and tried to move it, tried to take it away and couldn't manage. So then called in another friend, another little mouse, and together they took it away. And it said that's one of the few times in his life that Langri Tangpa smiled. So anyway, he when someone asked him why he always looked like that, he said, well, how can I be happy when sentient beings are suffering so much? So the story I want to tell you that relates very much to the approach that's being presented in this text, turning suffering and happiness into enlightenment, is that one time Langri Tangpa was teaching in a gompa, in a temple, to a group of disciples. And this woman suddenly burst in with a baby. And she walked up the aisle and deposited the baby in Langri Tangpa's lap and said, this is your child, you can take care of it. And so, of course, this was kind of dramatic and quite shocking. Langri Tangpa was a fully ordained monk. So what the woman was implying was that he'd broken his vows and fathered a child. So Langri Tangpa didn't miss a beat. He just took the child. The woman stormed out again, just took the child. He found someone to take care of the child and didn't respond to that criticism or to that slander or to the implication that he'd broken his vows. And then after a few years, then the woman had a change of mind and came back and apologized and said that she would now like a child back. And so just as calmly, Langri Tangpa handed the child back to the mother. So it's like what we're trying to accomplish in this mind training practice is this kind of level mind, this even mind. So in the face of disaster, in the face of triumph, your mind doesn't get too depressed when things go wrong or too elated and out of control when things go right. You know, that in this text, it's related to the Nyingma, the oldest tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. They talk about one taste, you know, that things are one taste, good or bad, it's one taste. In some ways, I mean, it's a horrible expression that's been misused now, is like whatever, you know, it's like whatever happens to you, good or bad, praise or criticism, your mind doesn't get moved too much. You know, you have some kind of evenness and levelness of mind. So there are many stories of the Kadampa Geshis that illustrate this. And then in terms of, you know, knowing that there are still practitioners similar to Kadampa Geshis in current time, I'd like to tell you a story about Lama Zopa Rinpoche. And so this involves, Rinpoche is always trying to build more and more holy objects all around the world. You know, he has huge, vast vision, and there's, I think he wants 1,000 Padmasambhava statues, 1,000 Maitreya statues, etc., etc. You know, and the reason for this is that he saw in a text, I think for both of the statues, he saw in a text that if there are these holy objects around the world, it will shorten the suffering of the world. That these periods that are being predicted of famine and war and difficulties will be shortened because of the presence and the blessing of these holy objects. So, you know, for Rinpoche, with his total faith, then that's what he's aiming to do. So he wanted to build, I think it was a larger Padmasambhava statue in Tibet near Lhasa. And so in his inimitable fashion, he attracted the benefactors who wanted to support that project. And so they had to purchase land, and it's not particularly cheap in Tibet. And they had these Tibetan intermediaries who were helping with the, you know, because there's all the legalities and working with the Chinese government in terms of acquiring the land. And so I think they sent a total of $1 million that was needed to acquire this land. But unfortunately, the Tibetan intermediaries were total scoundrels, and they took the money. They took all that money. So there was nothing to show at the end. I think they showed false papers showing that there had been the purchase, and they were found out to be false. So basically $1 million went down the drain. And so then probably the benefactors, but also other people wanted to bring legal, you know, take those people to court and try to recover the money. And Rinpoche's approach was no, he couldn't do that, because, you know, his thinking, along with what I was explaining yesterday, is that he or we as an organization must have created negative karma in the past, must have swindled people in the past that resulted in this life experiencing this particular suffering, and that the way to see it was seeing as exhausting that particular negative karma so that wouldn't have to continue to be experienced in other future lives, and not to kind of make the lives of those people who've stolen difficult, you know, have them in jail and suffering punishment or whatever. So basically that was $1 million that was just given away because of belief in karma and karmic repercussions. And I remember one time in a similar way of thinking, when I first met the Dharma, I lived at Tushita Retreat Center for a few years and worked in the center there. And I lived in a little A-frame, which I think is still there, probably much more decrepit when I was in it. It was fairly new, on the hillside. And so I worked up in the office during the day and basically just was there at night. And so the local Indians, of course, who were quite poor, saw us as rich people, even though most of us were quite poor travelers. And so twice that hut was broken into and things stolen. So they always took the Western goods, right? You know, because the nice Indian things I had, they didn't bother with. And the second time it happened, then Lama Zopa Rinpoche happened to be at Tushita. And so a friend of mine told him what had happened. And the urgency for him was for me to keep my mind positive about the whole experience. So the advice he immediately sent me was and also concern for the Indian person who'd stolen the things, and particularly this Western sleeping bag, which was my big attachment, keeping warm in Dharamsala. And so he immediately sent a message quite urgently that the way I should think was that I had actually offered all those things to that Indian man who'd broken the lock and stolen everything. So in that way, it keeps the karma. He doesn't collect the negative karma of stealing, right? Because I've offered it inadvertently and against my will. I'd offered him all the Western goods in my heart. So after that, I never got robbed again because all the Western goods were gone. So that was kind of a relief in some ways. So that's the kind of thinking, that the kind of radical change of thinking, you know, not always wanting to come out on top, not always wanting to be the one that wins in situations, but thinking quite deeply and in a subtle and extensive way about the repercussions of what we do and what we say. And it makes for a really careful life. And another example, and I'm sorry I'll bore you all with stories of Rinpoche, but he's the inspiration in my life. Another time I was traveling with Rinpoche as kind of attendant helper, and I do a lot. I take he dictates things and I take transcriptions. And he has this pencil case he travels with his pens in, and he brought out, and he was really looking at this pen in a really puzzled way. It was just not a particularly special pen, and then he must have remembered that he'd borrowed it from Sangye Kadro in Singapore. She was a resident nun in Singapore at that time, and he'd passed through Singapore on his way to Australia. And so he'd borrowed that pen from her. And so his concern about having taken something that belonged, even a simple pen that belonged to a nun, he dictated a letter to me and got me to email her and explain the situation and ask for her permission, you know, to have that pen, which of course she gave instantly. But you can see the kind of subtle care we need to take with karma. You know, someone like Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who's with realizations and amazing vast mind, still those little details are important. You don't discount those kind of things. And as we live or visit Dharma centers, we need to have that kind of awareness, you know, not to be careless or casual about what we do here in terms of the fact that there are many Sangha living here and it's a Dharma center. The things that the property here belongs to a Dharma center. So it's this kind of fine precision we need to be always checking what we're doing. Like Lama Yeshe says, watching our body, speech and mind and being very careful even with the little things, because we're potentially creating negativity that will ripen for many lives. So you just need that kind of, so the Kadampa Geshe tradition is not dead. And if you examine or around any of the lamas, you will see they have this kind of quality of, for example, not being upset by criticism or particularly carried away if someone praises what they do. And these things of being very careful about karma. So that Kadampa Geshe tradition continued, and it influenced all the 4 orders of Tibetan Buddhism. So as I explained yesterday, the oldest order is the Nyingma, and then came the Kagyu, and then the Sakya, and then the Gelugpa. So when you read, for example, Lamrim texts from any of the traditions, then you find very similar stories that are very much based on the Kadampa Geshes and their way of approach to Dharma. It's fundamental to all 4 traditions, which means it's quite important for us to know and learn about them. So then we come to this particular text here. So the famous, as I explained yesterday, the most famous mind training texts, thought transformation texts are the 8 verses by Langri Tangpa. And it was because of the 8 verses by Langri Tangpa that we then got the second important text, which is compilation of earlier material from Lama Salingpa, the teacher in Sumatra, and Lama Ratisha and other Kadampa Geshes, and that's the 7-point thought transformation. So how these teachings came to be public was that Geshe Chekawa, who was originally a Nyingma practitioner, came across the 8 verses of transformation, and he saw the particularly arresting verse in which Langri Tangpa advises us to offer the victory to others and take the loss upon ourselves, which is radical thinking, you know, because if you think about how we are usually even in our everyday life, is we always want the best for ourselves. We want to be the winners. We want to come out on top. Whatever's going, we want to have it. And it doesn't matter to us so much what happens with other people. So we would prefer to win and others to lose. So when Geshe Chekawa saw this verse, he was intrigued, and he'd never seen anything like that before. And so he set out in pursuit of the teacher. But at that time, Langri Tangpa by then had died. But his closest disciple was Geshe Sharwa. So Geshe Chekyawa went to Geshe Sharwa and studied with him for a long time and had received the lineage of the teachings on these thought transformation practices. And then, as I explained yesterday, he taught it to lepers in Lhasa, and it had great benefit for them. And the thing that seems to have turned his mind to make these teachings public was that he had a very difficult, angry-minded brother who listened in secret to these teachings. And when he saw, Geshe Chekyawa saw the change in his brother's mind, the softening of his brother's mind and the opening of his heart, then he thought, these teachings shouldn't be secret. If they can help someone as difficult as my brother, they can be helpful to everybody. And so from that point on, these teachings became public. And now it's quite commonplace to have commentaries and teachings on these texts and to study them in association with the Lam Rim, the graduated path to enlightenment. So then in, would have been the early 20th century, Dodrupchen Rinpoche, a Nyingma Lama, famous Nyingma Lama, he composed this particular text, Turning Suffering and Happiness into Enlightenment. So it's not particularly common for this, I think, for this text to be taught. And I've only seen, apart from Lama Zopa Rinpoche's teaching, which is published as Transforming Problems into Happiness, I've only seen one other partial commentary by a Nyingma Lama. So it's not so commonly taught, but it's quite a compact and easy to understand and easy to assimilate, difficult to practice text, about 8 pages long. And I explained yesterday, Dodrupchen Rinpoche was a very special Lama who was close to Patrul Rinpoche. Some of you may know him. He wrote The Words of My Perfect Teacher, which is a famous Lam Rim text. And Patrul Rinpoche got Dodrupchen Rinpoche when he was 8 years old to actually give a teaching on Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, which is quite extraordinary. And then it's said that in his lifetime, because of a promise he made to Patrul Rinpoche, that Dodrupchen Rinpoche actually taught 100 times this text, which is one of the fundamental texts on how to generate bodhicitta and on thought transformation. So Lama Zopa Rinpoche, in his extensive readings of texts, must have heard about or come across this particular text and decided it would be useful for the Western mind. And so taught a weekend course in 1987 in New Zealand on it, and then asked for it to be published as a book. So Venerable Rabina Korten and I worked on the first incarnation. It's had some further editing since, but it was in the early 90s. It was published as Transforming Problems into Happiness. So now coming to the text itself. So first, the Dodrupchen Rinpoche pays homage to Chenrezig, the Buddha of Compassion. And then he just has a small foreword, but it's interesting to read that what he says about this advice contained here is that it's indispensable for leading a spiritual life and quite the most priceless teaching in the world. So he's divided it initially into 2 parts. The first part being how to use suffering as the path, and the second is how to use happiness as the path. And the first part is the majority of the text, and then happiness as the path is just a short section at the end. And he approaches each one through what's called relative truth, and then through absolute truth, which is related to emptiness. So yesterday we began and discussed most of the section on using suffering as the path to enlightenment. So first through relative truth. So first, Dodrupchen Rinpoche points out that we have to be careful about our habits of mind. And if we make a habit of always seeing the little things that go wrong in our lives as major problems, then it all escalates. And we end up basically impatient, intolerant people who can't deal with even the slightest thing going wrong. And the end stage is described as all appearances and perceptions arising as enemies. So I gave you the example of me as a teenager when everything in my environment was unsatisfactory. But that's just an exaggeration of how we often are in our everyday life. And if you just think about the kind of conversations we have and the way we discuss things like the weather, if it doesn't suit us, you know. So I tried to practice a little thought transformation last summer, because normally summer is not my favorite season, winter is. And normally I avoid the Queensland summer because I go to India and Nepal when it's the what I regard as the least desirable season here. But of course, because of the pandemic, then I was caught in Australia and caught in Queensland. And so as my little thought transformation practice, I made the resolve not to complain about the heat, not to complain about the weather. But even though it was quite a strong resolve, I couldn't quite manage it. You know, I mean, I was pretty good. I didn't complain every day, but I did complain. And it's like, what's the point when you think about that? You know, you have no control over the weather. So it's something you have to endure, something you have to put up with. And just think about, you know, sometimes our and of course, these days with our phones, you can have the constant news about what's happening with the weather. And so there's not only that kind of anticipation, or, you know, and if you like cold, then you're getting fearful because it's getting cold. And if you don't like heat, you're getting fearful because it's getting too hot. But there's then also the aggravation of them getting it wrong, you know, and you making your plans, but actually it did rain when it wasn't meant to rain. So it's like these little things that, you know, if we don't develop tolerance with the little things, how are we going to handle the big things? And there's so many instances just of and I sometimes think we're like Goldilocks, you know, we want everything just right. And it's so seldom in our lives that everything is just right. And I remember in my first Lamrim course in Tushita in Dharamsala, when we were getting these extensive explanations on the suffering of change. So of course, the suffering of change, it's a bit hard to swallow that the first time you're introduced to that concept, that the things we think provide us with happiness or pleasure are actually sources of suffering. That's a bit radical and hard to digest. So when I was receiving the teachings on it, I remember having this discussion in my mind about, well, you know, that's okay and it kind of makes sense, but it's just a matter of getting it just right, you know, like the middle way, you know, not too much, not too. And then I realized that's what we try to do every day of our lives, is to get it just right. And it's part of our, you know, the whole thing of hopes and fears and our neuroticism and anxieties is it's so hard to get it right, you know, or even if it does get right, it changes. There's impermanence and it changes. And so I always think now that we're like Goldilocks. We want everything just right, you know. We want our food not too hot, not too cold, just the way we like it. We want our beds not too soft, not too hard. We want the weather not too hot, not too cold. And so it's like if we hold on to this, if we want things to be just right, that's the source of our suffering, because it's not the nature of our existence to cooperate in making things just right. And the other thing is, the wider view is what's just right for you is maybe not just right for the person next to you, right? So it's like we have to let go of or train with all these small things to change our habit of mind so that it kind of doesn't matter. What happens externally doesn't matter so much, you know, that our day isn't ruined if we don't get the food we want, or we get something in the food that we don't like. Our day isn't ruined if it happens to be raining when we want it to be sunny, or it happens to be hot when we want it to be cool. So we have to train in these small things to keep an even leveled mind, just an equanimous mind, that, you know, that it doesn't matter too much what's happening externally with what the elements are doing or what other people are doing or what's happening in our environment, because we have this steadiness or stability in our mind that just allows us to float along with it and not, you know, keep a relaxed, happy mind, no matter what's falling to pieces around us or what we think is falling to pieces around us. So the other thing to understand is, as we talked about briefly yesterday, is that this is seen as a degenerate age. I mean, supposedly, I'm not sure I believe in it. There was this mythical golden age, which was quite different. But in terms, what I can see as a degenerate age in terms of our limitations in regard to being able to follow a spiritual path, for example. I really think, you know, when I've been reading these texts, researching or preparing for this course, I kind of felt a pang when I kept reading about these lamas who could spend 20 years in retreat or 15 years in retreat, or to me had this kind of almost seemed like magical life where their whole life, every day of their whole life was centered on Dharma. You know, they took teachings, they took initiations, they did retreats, they gave teachings themselves. And really, for some of them, like Dodrupchen Rinpoche spent his last, he had an illness that meant he couldn't walk. So he spent his last 20 or so years basically in isolation, in terms he had people supporting him, but he couldn't walk outside his hermitage. So he spent his time in his hermitage meditating, reading, and occasionally giving teachings to only a select few people. And I can't even imagine these days having the opportunity, because it seems like luxury, doesn't it, to have a life where that's all you had to do, and you had a culture, a country that was supporting you in doing that, you know. So for example, in our organization, I mean, in some particularly the Kagyu seem to have organized a lot of 3-year retreats, right? So at one stage, Lama Zopa Rinpoche was very much encouraging, I think he still encourages, but not as often these days. He was encouraging more senior students to do the preliminary practices and prepare themselves for doing 3-year retreat. But I think you can count on one hand the number of people that were able to manage that, you know, because one thing is there's a lot to do within this organization, but also you need a lot of merit. You need to have created a lot of good causes. And especially these days, it seems, to be able to find the correct conditions, a good place to do retreat, and the kind of financial support you need these days, even to, you know, not have a luxurious retreat, but to have at least a retreat that's comfortable. So it just seems it is a degenerate age. It's harder and harder to gather the conditions for spiritual practice. So there we're just talking about the difficulty of doing a 3-year retreat or a 1-year retreat. And in Tibet, in previous centuries, people retreated for 20 years, 30 years. You know, some just locked themselves up for the rest of their life when they were quite young. So we have to accept that it is increasingly difficult. It is a degenerate age. There will be obstacles to our trying to achieve good things, whether in relation to spiritual path or other things. And so we have to have methods to deal with these obstacles and things that arise in a positive way. And the other thing we have to do is understand the cause of problems. So here, what we have to learn to do is not to blame anything or anyone outside. So I think for most of us, our first instinct when something goes wrong in our life is to point the finger at something or someone else, because somehow it's never our fault, or very rarely our fault. And so for a while, it seemed quite popular to blame your parents for whatever emotional difficulties you were having. And I think that was in some ways encouraged by some psychologists. And I remember hearing one disturbing, a friend of mine had a friend who he was quite, the friend of the friend was quite disturbed psychologically. So he was getting this therapy, this was like 70s or 80s, getting this therapy where the psychologist, so what he decided, or between them, the psychologist, they decided that his mother was the cause of his many problems, or the root cause of his problems. And so this psychologist encouraged him to punch a pillow, picturing that as his mother, as a way of, you know, because he had this repressed anger, to actually bring that, the psychologist felt that it was healthier to get that anger out by punching. So in Buddhist terms, that's just horrifying, the kind of imprints and the whole reasoning there. But we have to accept that that's what we tend to do, you know, that I know because I share a house, right? And I catch myself so often when something isn't quite right in the house or something's changed, my first thought is that Lasem did it, you know? And so often I find, no, I spaced out and I did it, you know? I moved it or didn't put it back or whatever. And it's just a habit, you know, that somehow we don't. And the other thing I find quite interesting that I do, and I think it's fairly common, is that if someone else makes a mistake, that's kind of concretely proving that they're thoughtless or, you know, an angry person or whatever. But if I do the same thing, my mind is already ready with all the justifications that I never apply to that other person. They're concretely bad. But, you know, if I make a mistake and do something or break something or hurt someone in some way, there's some justification, you know, because I was in a hurry or I didn't sleep well or I hadn't had lunch or my blood sugar was low. I never make those excuses for the other person. They're concretely bad. But for me, there's always a reason, you know, that I'm not responsible or I'm not fully responsible or I'm not a bad person. So we have to break this habit of always seeing the cause of our problems as something or someone outside ourselves. And it takes, we have to do a lot of listening, a lot of reading, a lot of discussing and thinking about this to come to understand the actual root cause of all our problems. Because unless we do that, we're just sort of dabbling on the surface, you know. It's like treating the symptoms of an illness and never actually diagnosing the cause and treating that. So in Buddhism, the actual root cause is our root ignorance, and it's often called self-grasping. So I talked about this a little yesterday. So this is the misconception we have about the way we exist. And so it's related to emptiness and our actual ignorance about emptiness that we would say instinctively, but maybe habitually is a better word. Habitually, we grasp at something concrete and permanent and continuing that's kind of inside us. So it's not used, that kind of self-grasping is not usually manifest. It's not usually obvious to us. But when you meditate on this, trying to get an idea of what it involves. So what is recommended to bring to mind is, for example, anytime that your life's been threatened, you know, or in danger. So if you've ever been involved in a road accident, and the one I bring to mind is I once, when I was in New Guinea, had someone threaten to kill me, and I had no reason to believe they weren't going to do it, you know? And so that kind of solid feeling, or the other thing that when it comes up really strongly is when you're unjustly accused of doing something you haven't done. So if you have that kind of experience in your life where, you know, there's that sudden feeling of this strong I, and that I is being attacked or is going to be harmed or is in danger, then that's the kind of habitual self-grasping that we're talking about, that feeling that there is something solid there. So when you meditate on this, you're often encouraged to bring those kind of things to mind. When your life's been threatened, you felt your life was in danger. It also happens if you're praised sometimes, you know, it's like, listen, I did it, you know, and those people are appreciating what a wonderful thing I did. So this I comes. But for me, the strongest ones come when I think about that incident in New Guinea. Also, I've had road accidents where I could have died. And yeah, and another instance was one time in Delhi, the center, the landlord and landlady live next door, and they have this German Shepherd dog who's basically trained to attack people. And then one day I came back with my shopping to the center, and it got out the gate and came at me. And I actually felt the hairs on my neck rise, you know, and then later when the gardener came out, it wasn't a bad ending to the story. The gardener came out and I had my shopping bag, so he bit into the shopping bag and the gardener took him away. But when I thought about it later, there was such an elemental feeling of that I was being threatened, that I was going to be hurt by this dog. And I thought later that would have been a perfect opportunity to think about emptiness, you know, that I didn't exist in that way, because you need that strong feeling, because otherwise your meditation doesn't have power and you don't get the insight into what you're trying to negate. So what we need to understand is that there is this self-grasping, this feeling of an instinctive quality within us that is some essence of us, if you like. And so you have to realize that this is a complete hallucination, complete illusion, a complete myth. And so when you think about, because when we usually think about ourselves, or introduce ourselves to others, the first thing you say is, I'm Yeshi, or I'm Georgie, or I'm Melgo, right? And so we have a certain assumptions about what that means, you know? And so in the case of Yeshi, the next explanation would probably be, I'm a Buddhist nun, I've been a nun for X years, you know, and let down the track, there's, you know, I'm Australian, I'm this or that. But we have this kind of feeling that there's something there that's us, that's some essence of us, some essence of Yeshi or Georgie or Melgo. But when you analyze how you came into existence, so however it came about, your mother and father had intercourse, and there was a meeting of the sperm from the father with the ovum from the mother, and then this body, this base of this body developed. And then according to Buddhism, at the point of that joining, then a consciousness from a previous existence joined that. And so then there's this base, that's what's called the base. The association of this body and mind is a simple way. You can say the 5 aggregates, but the simple way to understand it is there is an association of body and mind. And so then it came to your label, right? So it's like, for whatever reason, your parents decided on the individual label. So what was your Margaret? Was your the name they decided upon, not Yeshi. And so usually parents choose the name or have a choice of names. Sometimes it doesn't happen. I've heard recently of a case where a baby didn't have a name for, I think it was a Tibetan baby, didn't have a name for a couple of months because they couldn't decide on one. But usually their parents have looked at those books, or they've got traditional family names that they use or whatever, and they have a name in mind. And it needs that base to come out of the mother to be born for them to apply that label to that base. And the interesting thing is that before that label was applied, and the label could change, isn't it? There wasn't this concrete entity called the baby Margaret, right? There was just a baby. But once the label was applied, and there was a belief in that label, there needs to be belief as well. So then your parents were overjoyed because there was baby Margaret, you know, this association of body and mind, and they'd chosen their label and they'd put their label on it. And so there was baby Margaret. And so then whenever, from that time, whenever they saw your body and mind, the combination of your body and mind, then kind of habitually, instinctively, that's Margaret. Like there's some essence there. And there's no thought of that process of how that came about, that there was just a baby's body and mind. They're thought to apply a name or a label to it. And that's how it became the baby Margaret. It seems like there's a baby Margaret from its own side, once there's that labeling and belief in the label. And so then they taught you to believe in that, right? They taught you your name. And so then it's perpetuated. And then they introduce you to all their friends and the rest of the family as, this is baby Margaret. We're so happy we've got our baby daughter. And so then everybody, yes, that's a concretely existing Margaret. And they don't remember that tiny point where the baby had been born, but they didn't know the name, and that was the correct label. But now, once that's the correct label, and they believe that's the correct label for this particular association of body and mind, then it's a kind of concrete, self-existent, inherently existent Margaret. And so basically for the rest of your life, until you changed your name or accepted the change of name to Yeshi, then every time people who have been introduced to that label for that body and mind and believe in it, they trust the person who's telling them that that person is called Margaret. Every time you see that person, well, it's just obvious that that's Margaret. Or now it's obvious that that's Yeshi, because we're introduced, we believe that was the name you were given when you were ordained. We accept that. So it's Yeshi. So what we forget is that there is no concrete, self-existent, inherently existent, a Margaret that exists, or Yeshi that exists from its own side, that we're involved in that labeling. So this is what happens in terms of ourself. We forget that this is just a base that a label has been applied to. And the label, of course, in this case, in terms of self-grasping, is I. We call this particular combination, association of body and mind, I. And the problem is that we forget that process of labeling. We forget that our mind is involved in that process, that there's a base, a body and mind, and label I, and our mind or our thought applies that label to this particular body and mind. It doesn't feel like that. It feels like there's this I. And every time that I is threatened, then you get a close look at how we hold on so tightly, what that self-grasping feels like when you're in danger, or when you're about, or you've been unjustly accused or criticized. Then that strong feeling of I is the one that we try to engender when we're meditating on the emptiness of the I, because it's that one that is the dangerous one, the one that we have to kind of negate or refute, that the I exists in that concrete, hard, self-existent way, which is a myth. So then on the basis of this self-grasping, of believing that there is this self-existent, inherently existent I, then we develop what Lama Zopa Rinpoche calls self-cherishing. So some Westerners have a difficulty with that term, and I can understand, because with problems in the West of low self-esteem and things, and cherishing yourself, it sounds like, and self-cherishing thought is seen as the greatest evil, right? So I think it's, for me, it's because it's Lama Zopa's term. When I edit, I use that term. But I think for me, what works more successfully is to think that self-centeredness comes on the basis of that self-grasping, and then you think about that. You think about the way, so self-cherishing, the way Lama Zopa talks about, or self-centeredness, if you want to use that term, it's this feeling that this I is the most important one. There may be billions of other humans in this world, but what happens with this I is what's important. And so that self-centeredness or self-cherishing is, on the basis of that self-grasping, is this thought that you're more important than others. And so that's the one that we're trying to stop completely, if possible, and that's what bodhisattvas do, is stop that thought of cherishing the self, cherishing the I, and instead, in place of that, and that's why you're exchanging self for others, that kind of concern you have for your own well-being, you transfer to others, and not just family and friends or human beings, but to every single living being. You try to transfer that kind of concern you usually have for your own happiness and well-being to every other living being. So that self-cherishing comes on the basis of self-grasping, and then the other delusions kind of blossom from that. So in terms of our self-cherishing and the importance we place on our own happiness, then the things that seem to support that happiness, to bring us happiness, or, kind of do good things for us, make us happy, we see them as friends or close ones. And what the mind tends to do is develop attachment to those people. So, my friends, my family, my possessions. And so, as I pointed out yesterday, attachment is simply the exaggeration of the good qualities of something and the wish to possess it. And then for those things or people that seem to want to harm this I, this complete myth, that we cherish so much, that we're concerned about so much, then aversion or hatred or anger arises towards those things and people. So and then, as I explained yesterday, hatred or anger is defined as exaggerating the negative qualities of something and wishing to harm it or to get rid of it. And then, so they're the three, what is seen basically as the three basic delusions, the three basic causes of our problems. The self-grasping and self-cherishing go together. And then on the basis of that, attachment and aversion arise. And then the other delusions. I mean, it's said that Buddha taught 84,000 teachings for our 84 delusions. So there's no lack of delusions. So the main, if they're divided into the 5 major ones, then it's ignorance. And there it's not just general ignorance, but the most important ignorance is this ignorance about the way we exist. And then attachment, anger, and then pride and jealousy can be seen as the 5 major delusions, the 5 major things we need to work on. So these are the basic cause of our problems. So once we understand this, then it makes it even clearer that we can't blame anything outside for what we're regarding as our problems, that nothing or nobody can be blamed, that it all comes from our own mind. So the other way that it comes from our own mind is through an understanding of karma. So we talked about the 4 usual preliminaries to thought transformation teachings. So just briefly to repeat those again, the first one is usually defined as perfect human rebirth. So that basically is just appreciating the special situation you're in and the freedom you have to pursue spiritual goals, because you've been born with the body and mind that you have that allows you the freedom to basically do anything you want in some ways. The next awareness we need to have is awareness of impermanence and death. So the point of this is not to make us anxious or depressed, but to give us some urgency about our practice, because while we have this delusion of permanence, that things won't change, it doesn't take a very deep analysis to see that things are changing moment by moment, and that inevitably they lead to death, and that none of us can predict, unless we have clairvoyance or omniscience, none of us can say that, for example, we'll be alive at the end of the day, or that we'll wake up from sleep tomorrow. And so, again, this is not to make us anxious, but just to see that if we keep procrastinating, if we keep putting things off, then suddenly, and the other thing to take into account is aging. So we might think that, okay, I need to, set myself up. I need to have a good super fund. And then once I've finished my work and had my family, had my career, and I've got my good super fund, then I'll meditate. Then I'll follow a spiritual path. Then I'll do that in my retirement. But the thing we don't take into account when we're making these plans when we're younger is that there are changes with age. That the body and mind don't become as capable of following the spiritual path generally as we age. And this has been highlighted recently by a student, a friend of ours, who's been diagnosed with dementia. So any plans she had for doing spiritual practice or pursuing the spiritual path have now disappeared. And it can happen, death can happen to any of us at any time. And as it's pointed out in the text, there are many more causes for death than causes that support life. This body is actually very fragile. So what we need to develop is this sense of urgency about the importance of practicing Dharma, or following a spiritual path. Then the next outline is karma. And then the final outline was seeing the suffering nature of existence. So in terms of how everything comes from our mind, it is related to karma. And so what we have to understand is that over countless lifetimes, in Buddhist terms, we've created various positive and negative karmas that influence our experiences. So the first law of karma is that karma is definite. And so what this means is that positive thoughts and actions lead to happiness, whether in this life or in future lives, and negative thoughts and actions result in suffering, whether in this life or in future lives. So again, because of this karma, these karmic imprints on our mind, then when we're experiencing something we're labeling as a problem, we have to accept it comes from a previous negative thought or action. And it's not because our mother didn't love us when we were a child, or, something's wrong in our environment, or people are doing things. It comes because we've created the causes for what we're experiencing. So once we accept that things come from our mind, that it's our responsibility, so then we go on to start considering the things we regard as problems or suffering in our life. And what Kyabje Rinpoche is trying to get us to aspire to is not only being able to deal with problems with some kind of level or stable mind, seeing things as one taste, but to actually welcome problems and to have a joyful mind when they happen, which is this radical aspect of thought training, because that is definitely not how we normally are. We want a calm, peaceful, happy life with no problems, and we tend to get unsettled when a problem arises. But he's asking us to work on reversing this attitude, so that instead of getting anxious and fearful and unhappy when some difficult situation happens, that we actually become joyful and welcome it. And of course, the only way to do that is we have to see the benefits of acting like that, because that's how we are. We have this kind of business approach to how we make decisions in our life. And basically, we need to see the disadvantages of not doing it and the advantages of doing it, the practices that he's proposing. So the disadvantages of not practicing thought training is, as we pointed out before, that if we don't practice thought training, then because it is degenerate age, because there will be problems and obstacles, if we don't have some methods to deal with them, then we become more and more unhappy, anxious, and incapable of dealing with them, until we reach that state where everything appears unsatisfactory, that all appearances appear as our enemy. And so what he's proposing, the methods the techniques he's advising us to adopt here, reverse that attitude, so that we become like Milarepa. We become, hearing everything as advice. Everything that happens in our lives doesn't disturb our minds, and we actually welcome the difficulties, seeing them as an opportunity to improve our spiritual practice. So he actually, Dodrupchen Rinpoche actually recommends that we make the resolve, from now on, whatever suffering I face, I will not become anxious, and train yourself to develop a strong feeling of courage. So then he goes through some basic things you can think about to try to adopt these kind of attitudes. So first, he points out with that verse from Shantideva, which is very simple, but we often forget to apply it when we're approaching something we're regarding as a difficulty. If you can do something to solve a problem, then there is no need to be unhappy about it. And if you can't, then it doesn't help to be unhappy about it either. So this is, what can you say? It's obvious, right? But it's all very well to read something like that and say, well, that's obvious. But then when you check up and see whether you actually do that in your daily life, that's the important thing. Do you actually think like that when you have what is a problem? And it's a great way, if you can apply it, just to at least divide problems into those that you have some control over and those that you don't. Because if you do have some possible solution to what you're seeing as a problem, then what's the big deal? Why do you need to be upset? You just apply that solution, see if it works. Maybe it does, and no need to talk about that problem again. And if it is a problem that you can't see a solution for, then again, it doesn't help to be worrying about it, to be obsessing about it, because it's out of your control. So one instance when I was thinking about this morning that came to mind was many, many years ago in the early 90s. I was working on helping set up an archive of Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa's teachings. And I was based in Hong Kong at that stage, because the person who was benefacting the process of setting up the archive lived there. And so I went to Hong Kong from India and Nepal to work for a year or so. And so we had certain personality clash in regard to how to do the job and the way it should be done, the speed it should be done. And there was a bit of to and fro. And then in the midst of that, I was asked to, or I'd agreed to do this big job organizing a large long-term spiritual event in India. So I had to leave the archive with him, because I had to go away for, I think it was 6 or 9 months to do the other job, And I remember initially I was so stressed out. I was kind of angry, and I didn't, and then I started to check out what was happening, and I saw that it was my attachment to having it done my way. And so I was having all this anxiety and fear about it was going to be out of my control, and it was going to be ruined while I was away, blah, blah, blah. And then I saw that since I'd accepted, Lama Zopa Rinpoche had asked me to do the other job, and since I'd accepted to do it, there was no choice. I couldn't be in 2 places at one time. And it was just, I still remember the feeling that came, because I'd been so stressed out and anxious and intense about the whole thing. And when I thought it through and thought, oh, well, there is no choice, I have to let go of what's happening with the archive, it was like they describe in the text, it felt like liberation. My mind just completely let go of it and calmed down because there was nothing I could do. And sometimes it's that simple. If we can analyze a situation, sometimes it is just that simple. If you can let go of that, then it is like liberation. You're freed your mind from all that obsessive thinking about a situation in which you have no control. There's no solution you can apply to what you're seeing as a problem. So that's the first step when you're coming across a difficult situation that you're labeling a problem, is to see whether there is anything you can do about it. If there is, do it, simple. And if there isn't, then let go. If you can't change the situation, if you can't alter it, then you have to accept and you just have to let go and stop obsessing and thinking about it and stressing about it. And that's exactly right. That's the problem if we can't let go, is that we do get anxious and stressed, but to no point. So now next, Dr. Rinpoche is suggesting how we cultivate an attitude of being happy that we have problems. And the way to do this, of course, because he's a Lama, is to see it as a means of helping us in our spiritual practice, in our Dharma practice. And so yesterday we went through these various methods. So I thought today to go through them again, just using maybe a simple example, because the advice is that when you're applying these, learning to apply these techniques in your life, you start with the small things. Don't start with the big things. Train your mind in the small problems. So I thought we could just think about having the example of, say, we get a cold these days because of the pandemic and us not having such close contact. We're not getting colds as often, but I'm sure we have memories of getting a cold. So there is no cure for the common cold. There's various things you can do to help with the symptoms, but it's something that you go through. And you know that, okay, you can have your Lemsips and your this and that and have your, remedies for it. But chances are you're going to have 3 or 4 days of not feeling particularly well and maybe even mentally not functioning quite as well. You're going to feel not up to your usual jobs. So just as a way of training, and here, of course, we have about, 8 or 10 different techniques that Dodron Rinpoche is suggesting we apply to the situation. But what he suggests also is that some of these will have a stronger meaning for you than others. And so you don't try to apply all of them. You apply some of them or one of them and concentrate on that as a means of changing your view of the situation. So, okay, let's say we're feeling a little miserable because we've got a cold. And so we think, okay, I want to change my attitude. I don't want to be miserable and feel stressed out about this. I want to turn it into a positive experience. So let's go through Dodron Rinpoche's advice on how we might do this with the example of us having a cold and not feeling quite well. So the first thing he suggests is that we could use our cold just as a way of reminding us of the kind of existence we're caught in. Just remind us about the nature of samsara. So when the cold comes, then instead of sort of thinking about, oh, it came from that person because they coughed or they sneezed near me, I know that, you don't worry about that. That's just a condition. And you think about the fact that it's nothing very surprising or very shocking that you have a cold, that it's just the nature of samsara, the nature of psychic existence, that these kind of things happen. And then you think about the fact that this is just a little suffering. You're just going to feel a little unwell and be blowing your nose and maybe coughing for 3 or 4 days. But compared to even in terms of what other sufferings you can experience in your life, it's really very small and insignificant. And it's just reminding you that because you've been born with this body and mind, which is an endless ocean of suffering, then of course little things like colds and other bigger problems are going to happen. And what ideally it should make you think about is the solution, the escape from this. And so it should turn your mind in the direction of liberation from samsara, or as this term renunciation that's used in the subheading, or it's more the desire to be free, the definite exit from this cycle of suffering. So just having a cold can remind you of the nature of the existence that you're experiencing, and more importantly, that there is an exit, there is a solution, there is an escape from this, that if we follow the spiritual path and develop realizations in our mind, then a state of liberation is possible. And not just liberation from having a cold, but liberation from every single suffering. So with any problem that we're experiencing, this is what can happen. It can just remind us about the nature of samsara, and also just remind us that it's not inevitable that we're caught in this suffering state, that there is a path to freedom, there is a path to liberation from it. So the second method that Dodrup Rinpoche would recommend is that we use our cold to train in taking refuge. So what he suggests here is you can think throughout all my lives, one after the other, the only source of refuge from problems such as this cold, the only refuge that never fails is Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And you can add the Guru to that as well, the three jewels. So I must rely on them totally, and whatever happens, I will never renounce them. So this is just talking about faith, spiritual faith. So if you're Buddhist, of course, it's in Guru, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. But if you're Christian, then it's likely to be in God or Jesus Christ or Mary. And according to the different religions, you have different refuges. So when you're feeling a little miserable, then in terms of getting support, in terms of feeling nurtured or protected, then you can think of your objects of refuge, Guru, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So that's an advantage of having the cold, that instead of getting on and distracting yourself with the usual things, that you actually get reminded of the refuge in your life, Guru, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So the next technique that Dodrup Rinpoche recommends is using our problem, using our cold to remove arrogance. So I guess the way to do this is like, normally there's a certain arrogance, I think, in having a healthy body and mind. We feel in control and that, we're on top of things, we're dealing with our life. And so just be reminded of what a little virus, a little thing that you can't even see, the radical change it can make to our feelings of happiness and well-being. And so just feeling a little humble about the fact that, in actual fact, even though we try to pretend we have independence or freedom, the big word these days, and control, that we don't, that we're open to external influences. And the other thing we don't have control over is our own mind. So we're open to experiencing things like colds and many other problems. So there's a lot of reasons to be humble and not many reasons to feel arrogant. So the fourth one, which is an important one, Dodrup Rinpoche advises us to use our cold and to think that it's a means of purifying our harmful and negative actions. So this, of course, is related to this understanding of karma. And if you have faith in the laws of karma, it makes complete sense. And if you don't, then maybe not so much sense. So the thinking here is that we've created various negative karmas because of our deluded minds in countless past lives. And these ripen as various problems. So now it's ripened as a cold. So if we can experience this ripening of this particular negative karma, this small illness of having a cold, without generating further negative thoughts and actions in relation to that, such as getting angry, getting upset, doing things because we are feeling miserable. If instead we can just accept it as actually exhausting that previous negative karma, that previous cause that's created this effect, then it purifies that negative karma, and it means that that's the end for that negative karma, that we don't continue to experience it in this life and in future lives. So this is a way of seeing whatever negative thing we're experiencing, even something as small as a cold, as positive, because we're purifying, we're exhausting previous negative karma. and won't have to have those suffering experiences in the future. So the next technique suggested by Dodruchen Rinpoche is that we can use that suffering of having a cold to find joy in positive action. So this is similar to the negative karma. So when we have the cold and we're feeling a bit miserable, then we can think about the fact that we, just like everybody else, we like to be happy. And so that if we want to experience happy events rather than the miseries of having a cold, then we need to create the causes for that happiness. And of course, this is positive thoughts and actions, which ripen as happiness. So if we want to be happy later in this life and in future lives, then we need to create the causes for that through positive thoughts and actions. And of course, in the Dharma and the spiritual path, there are many things that qualify as positive thoughts and actions. But generating compassion is one of the main ones. And that leads us to the next technique suggested by Dodruchen Rinpoche, which is that we use our cold to train in compassion. So this is simple. So we've got our cold, our nose is running, we've maybe got a cough, and our head is all congested, maybe got a headache, we can't function the way we normally do. And so we know that we're not the only person in this world with a cold, that there are many others, possibly millions of people around the world who are experiencing colds. And so we generate a strong thought of compassion, aware of our own suffering that we experience because of this illness. Then we just call to mind that we're not alone. We're just one human being, one sentient being, one living being. And there are countless others, millions of others maybe, who have colds around the world. And so we just open our heart with the thought of compassion. So that compassion is simply the wish from your heart that other beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering, their negative karma and delusions. So as a similar thing with this, you can also use your illness, your cold, to train your mind in loving kindness. So loving kindness is simply the wish from your heart for other beings, every other living being, to have happiness in its causes, positive thoughts and actions. So again, you're there feeling miserable, devoid of happiness. And so you want to feel healthy and whole again and be functioning fully, mentally and physically. So it's just like that with every other living being. Every other living being with a cold is feeling exactly like that. So you, again, open your heart and generate a strong thought of loving kindness or love and have this sincere wish that every other living being has happiness in its causes, positive karma and positive thoughts. So then the final one that Dodruchen Rinpoche, the technique that he suggests, is that you use your cold for meditation on others being more dear than oneself. And here he says that since the very reason you're not free from suffering is that you have cherished yourself as most important since time without beginning, since beginningless time, now you should practice thinking, I will cherish others, for this is the source of all happiness and well-being. So what this is related to here is actually the practice of taking and giving, known as Tonglen in Tibetan. So this is a very brave mind, and I'd like to introduce it more possibly in the next session and do a meditation on it, because it's a very powerful way to develop the precious mind of bodhicitta. So in it, you actually have the courageous mind, the brave mind that wants to take on. You're experiencing whatever you're cold, whatever other problem you have, whatever suffering you're experiencing. And as Lama Zopa calls it, you try to see that as the ornament of the suffering of all other beings. I have a friend, she's still alive, a French student who has quite crippling rheumatoid arthritis and really debilitated with it. I mean, she used to it was very difficult for her, but she used to come to India at one stage every year to Root Institute, but then she became so unwell that she didn't. I mean, she'd had joint replacements. Her body was quite deformed with the rheumatoid arthritis. And it's an illness that also makes you feel systemically unwell. It's not just that you have swollen joints, but you feel unwell. So at one point she was just exhausted by the suffering. And so she went to see Lama Zopa Rinpoche to ask for advice about practices or things she could think to deal with this situation. And Rinpoche was direct as ever. So, you know, she tried all the solutions. She'd had gold injections and joint replacements and every treatment you could think of, and it wasn't resolving the situation. So Rinpoche's advice to her was to see her illness and the manifestations of her illness as like an ornament that represented the suffering of all other living beings. So to wear it proudly like an ornament, or like and sometimes he says like a medal, you know, that what you're experiencing, you're taking on the suffering of similar experiences that other people are having. So this is the very brave mind that practices Tonglen, taking and giving. So again, when you're first introduced to this notion, it can be quite confronting because most of us feel we have enough trouble dealing with our own problems on a day-to-day basis, let alone taking on the problems of others. So of course, what you have to understand is that you don't actually take on those problems. It's a matter of training your mind, of opening your heart to the suffering of others. It's not that you then physically compound the problems you're experiencing. It's a way of opening your mind and transforming your mind in relation to that problem you're experiencing, even if it's just a cold. So the thinking is that you think, okay, I have this cold, I'm feeling miserable. So since I have to go through it, there's no solution, there's no immediate cure for a cold, then why don't I see it as representing the colds that are being experienced by all those other millions of people around the world who have a cold? And by my experiencing it, this is the mind of compassion, taking on the suffering of others. By my experiencing it, may they be free from that particular suffering. So that's the aspect of compassion, of taking from others. And then next step in this meditation, which we'll go through more thoroughly in the next session, the next step is generating the thought of loving kindness or love, where you're wishing happiness for others. So then you send out to all those beings, once you've taken their suffering from them, even the suffering of the cold, you send out to them everything you value, every good thing that you have, you possess, you send out to them. So you usually visualize either your body as a wish-granting jewel or a wish-granting jewel in your heart, and then you just visualize sending out to them your body, your possessions, and you know that whatever you send out to them brings them what that person needs, whether it's good health, relief from a cold, medicine, whatever. And in this meditation, you even send out your merits, your positive energy, which are the cause of happiness. So, and your good qualities, any good qualities you have, send them out as like radiant white light rays that go to each of those beings. With the first step of the taking, you've taken on their suffering, relieved them of their suffering. So now that they're relieved of suffering, you send them out happiness in whatever form, in whatever happinesses you have, and in whatever form they need. So it's a very powerful meditation for increasing your compassion and loving kindness and developing the mind of relative bodhicitta, which is this mind that wishes to become enlightened, a fully enlightened being, in order to be able to bring all other living beings to enlightenment, in order to be able to relieve every other living being of their suffering and bring them happiness, but particularly the ultimate happiness of enlightenment. So then yesterday I just mentioned another couple of techniques or things you can think in relation to having a problem. That one of these is mentioned later by Dodrutra Rinpoche, but I think it's good to have the list together. So the next one that I mentioned was that you can use your cold as a reminder of impermanence, which is along with emptiness, one of the to basic meditations that we need to be aware of almost constantly if we can in our daily life. So just think about the fact that the cold's reminding you that things change. You were healthy, you were symptom-free, and now things have changed. Things are impermanent. Now you've developed an illness. It's just reminding you that things change, not only on a daily basis, but from moment to moment. And so while we find this intellectually obvious and very easy to understand, it's often not our lived experience, because our mind has this kind of illusion of permanence, or we want, when things are going well, when we're feeling healthy, when we've got comfortable situation, when we've got good relationships with people, then we kind of instinctively grasp at them as being permanent. But it doesn't take long for things to change. So our cold is just reminding us about the nature of impermanence of samsara, that while we grasp on things as permanent and want them to be permanent, they don't exist in that way. They're changing from moment to moment. And as Lama Zopa often points out, decaying from moment to moment, and they end. So in terms of our own body, we might be just a minor cold, but it can remind us that our body is changing from moment to moment, not only changing, but deteriorating. And that at some point, hopefully not from the cold, but from other conditions, at some point it will end in death. And again, this is not to make us anxious and depressed, but just to remind us to have some urgency about our spiritual practice, not to procrastinate, not to put things off, because there's no guarantee about the future. None of us can guarantee when we're going to die and how we're going to die. And that applies to the young, not only to the old. So then the next one I mentioned was that we can use our cold to remind us of emptiness, the suffering of the cold. So this is the absolute truth, which Dodruchen Rinpoche actually mentions a little later, but I'll mention here as part of this list. So when we're experiencing a cold or any other, excuse me, any other thing we've labeled a problem, just remember that labeling process, that what you're experiencing is merely labeled by your mind, that the merely labeled I is experiencing a merely labeled cold and is calling it a problem, labeling it a problem. So just remembering that you have a choice. And so in terms of that cold, it's just a merely labeled cold. And it's definitely just a merely labeled problem. And by applying these techniques outlined by Dodruchen Rinpoche, then you can change that label. You don't have to label it a problem. You can label it as something helpful in your spiritual practice, because it's allowing you to apply these techniques and to relax your mind about what you're labeling a problem. And so you can change the label. It's up to your mind how you perceive any situation you're involved in. And if you choose to label having a cold a problem, and you believe in that label, believe that having the cold is a problem, then it becomes a problem. But you forget that you've merely labeled it and you see it as this concrete, self-existent problem. So it becomes heavier to bear, it becomes heavier to deal with. And if even you can just use terms like merely labeled, say the merely labeled I as experiencing a merely labeled problem, having this merely labeled cold, then somehow even what I find anyway, is even using those words kind of lighten the experience. It stops that concrete holding on to something as negative and being seen in one way, and gives you the other option of seeing it as something that's helpful. And if you apply these techniques, then you can see how it becomes helpful, or at least how it doesn't disturb your mind, that you stop seeing it in a negative way and start to see it a little more positive way. And ideally, you could see that if you do apply these techniques and have success in these techniques, then you could see, at the level of imagination in my case, I don't have a direct experience of this, but you could see how it could become a joyful experience, and how you could welcome what are usually regarded or labeled as difficulties in your life, because of the opportunity it gives to apply these Dharma practices to it. So then the final one I mentioned, and it came up because when I was previously doing courses on thought training, often came up this idea of self-esteem. And so one benefit I thought that you could apply to having any problem, having a cold, is that, you know, by dealing with it in a positive way, then it could be a way to increase your self-confidence, increase your feelings of competence about dealing with difficult situations. So again, emphasizing that we start off small, that we train our mind just like an athlete trains their body. We train our mind by starting with small things. And yesterday I was suggesting road rage might be a good one, but minor illnesses, minor irritations, things like being criticized by someone. And by training in these, and one thought I wanted to mention to you, it's one powerful thing that Geshe Tashi Tsering once said in teachings here. And he said, you know, when someone criticizes us, we normally reject it. We get upset, or we instantly start justifying, rationalizing in our mind why that person isn't right, or, you know, what they got wrong and what they didn't understand about the situation, because it seems impossible we could have made a mistake. So what he said is that when someone criticizes you, you should listen very carefully because they might be right. So it's like having this, again, this level mind, this stable mind, this equanimous mind that doesn't emotionally react anytime someone seems to be attacking you, that you have to objectively assess what they're saying and just see whether maybe it's correct, you know? So we don't need to instinctively react, and we don't need to criticize that person in turn, but we do need to listen carefully just in case there could be something we could learn from it. And in this way, it would actually help our spiritual practice being criticized. And so there are lots of verses related to how it's better to be criticized than to be praised, because being criticized reminds us of the nature of samsara and points out our faults and mistakes, and being praised often just simply increases our arrogance, our pride. So the Kadampa Geshis, of course, have a lot of slogans related to these things and pointing out the positive benefits of what we normally regard as problems. So at this point, we'll take a break for half an hour. So we'll meet back again at 11 o'clock. So please enjoy a cup of tea or a rest.